Good afternoon, everyone. In this lecture, I'm going to be speaking for a few moments about literary analysis. Literary analysis will be the key means by which we're going to be gaining a deeper understanding of the texts that we're reading this semester. In other words, this is going to be one of our key tasks. So, it's important for us to understand what literary analysis is and how we perform literary analysis. So, what is literary analysis? Well, literary analysis is actually an umbrella term that we use in English studies to describe the evidence that we're using and the way in which we are using this evidence. That is, the way in which we examine our evidence in order to arrive at a deeper understanding of it. So, unlike scientific fields, English scholars rely on qualitative data in the form of quotations, theory, or historical or cultural information in order to arrive at a precise and deep understanding of our reading materials. In other words, when you're performing literary analysis, you're going to find that the poem, the story, the novel, or the film that we're examining becomes the primary evidence. And then you'll examine that evidence in order to arrive at a deeper understanding of it. And just to let you know, I will be referring to literary analysis and close reading quite a bit throughout the semester and often interchangeably because the two are basically the same thing. So, the purpose of literary analysis is to read and understand our textual material, that is, our weekly reading, by breaking down the reading into its component parts and then thinking about how those parts inform both the text as a whole and then also the way in which this text functions within the wider world into which it's been published. So, in particular, in literary analysis, we seek to understand how the deeper meaning of the text intersects with the way in which it's been written. Now, whenever I think about a given piece of reading, it's best to think about it as existing on two levels. At the surface is what I like to call denotation, and that is what the text says. This might be something like the plot of the text or just a very kind of baseline and shallow understanding of what's going on in a given story or a given novel or poem. But then below that is what the text connotes. That's the level of connotation, which is basically what a text says, quote unquote, between the lines. Um, Now, when we examine denotation, oftentimes this is kind of the first way in which we understand a text. That is, that we, for example, if you're reading a story, that you understand what's going on in the story, you understand the major characters, and you kind of have an inkling that there are important things that are going on in the characters. But when we begin to want to think about what the text connotes, that's where things really begin to get interesting. And when we're examining a literary analysis, what we want to do is look at with the way in which these two levels intersect with each other. So there's three different levers that we can pull to explore connotation. The first is that we can use close reading, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. And close reading is really a way in which you um, read back through a text and examine the way in which the text uses the craft of language in order to make deeper meaning. That is, the kinds of words that have been chosen, the type of grammar that's been chosen. You can also arrive at connotation by studying theory, and we're going to be doing that as well. And one of the things you can do is use theory as a kind of lens through which to understand a given text. And the final way in which you can understand it, the connotations of a given text, are through historical or cultural information. And we're going to be doing that as well throughout the semester, which is why we're going to be reading some historical works. And I'll give you background information on the way in which those texts function within their own given cultural moment. And that, again, provides a kind of lens through which to read the text and to understand kind of the deeper meaning that's going on in the text. So, close reading, then, which is the first of those three levers that I mentioned, is a way of reading the text to understand precisely and deeply what it means. That is, it is a form of literary analysis. But you do it when you focus on how a passage manages to say the things it wants to say without saying them directly. So, put another way, it's where you focus on how a passage uses language in order to say those things that it wants to say, in particular, the way in which it connotes certain things that it wants to say. So we actually have a variety of tools that we can use when we're closely reading. And these are linguistic tools that the author himself or herself has actually drawn on in order to make their text richer and deeper as they're writing it. So I'll go through these tools with you. One of the tools that you can use is something like tone or voice. And tone or voice are basically, you can examine those through different narrators, through characters, through the way in which the text sort of seems to feel, what the attitude of the text sort seems to be. Excuse me. Is it angry? Is it playful? Is it menacing? You can also examine metaphors, similes, or images within the text. So that is figures of speech that are being used to create richer or deeper meanings. You can look at dialogue versus description. Dialogue occurs when two characters are talking to one another, whereas description occurs when the narrator is telling you something. But these two are not necessarily discrete categories. You can also just look at structure. Any kind of a literary work is structured much in the same way as a building itself is structured. And literary pieces are made up of different component elements. So you can examine what those elements are and then how those elements fit together. You can also look at things like repetition. Are you noticing a repeated pattern of words, of phrases, repeated scenes, repeated ideas? And is this a pattern that the author wants you to notice, and why? You can also examine ambiguities within the text. Oftentimes, when students read text, they come up to me and tell me that there's a piece of the text that they don't understand. And oftentimes, it's not because they haven't understood it, it's because the text itself is being deliberately ambiguous. There are moments where the text seems to be deliberately sort of puzzling the reader. And these might be something where, like, the author is trying to encourage the reader to ask questions or to not fully understand something or to dig deeper, almost as though the reader was trying to solve a puzzle. Um, You can also look at things like conventions or traditions. Just as in architecture, literature relies on certain conventions. We have certain ways of saying things, certain ways of building stories. So, for example, when you read the phrase once upon a time, you know that you're in the realm of fairy tales. That's because that opening phrase, once upon a time, is a convention within fairy tales. But that's not the only convention. There's plenty of different conventions that authors draw upon when they're writing, and you can examine the way in which a given text draws upon and then potentially riffs off of a convention. You can look at the syntax of a text. It's a fancy way of saying its grammar. Is it are the sentences really long? Are they really short? Does the author use a lot of nested phrases? Does the author have periods? Does the author have run-on sentences? These types of things can tell you something about the text. You can also examine diction. It's one of my favorites. Diction is a very fancy way of saying word choice. Authors choose words just as we choose words when we're speaking very carefully in order to convey a kind of rich meaning for the reader. When we're examining poetry, we can also look at meter. Meter is a literary device that creates the pattern of sound within a line of poetry through the combination of stressed and unstressed words. We can also look at rhyme in poetry, which is the repetition of identical or similar sounding words within a given poem. And then finally, we can look at visual images. So you can examine whether or not there's illustrations within a work of literature. And if so, if those illustrations are in color or in black and white, do they have a relationship to the written text? Do they fill in details that are left unsaid? Do they not do this? Do they provide a contrast to the text? So these are all different tools that you can deploy when you're reading in order to examine your text more closely. So here's some advice that I give for students when they start to closely read. First of all, this is just general advice for reading. One, don't read on the computer. Typically, when we read on the computer, we do not read as deeply as we do when we're reading something on paper. So I always recommend that for literary work, students print them out so you can highlight and annotate it. And that's the second piece of advice. When you're reading, you should read with a pen or pencil in hand in order to underline, to circle, or to note things that seem really important to you. Then, as you're reading, you should read really carefully, looking for some of the following. One is sort of passages, sentences, or phrases that seem to just sort of explode with meaning. This could be for many different reasons. It could be because it encapsulates a central idea. It could be because the words are really particularly beautiful, either visually or musically. It could be the words seem to speak to you. It could be they're really disturbing. It could be they're really confusing. Note those moments down because those typically are places where the author is encouraging you to pay more attention. You also, as you're reading, should be looking for patterns of either language or of ideas, things, patterns that seem really important to you. And also, you should be looking for places where it seems like a word or a phrase is meant to be read in more than one way. So now that we have that in mind, what I want to do is go back through with my close reading tools in order to understand what the text is connoting and how it's making this connotation. And this is part of what I'm going to be asking you to do in your discussion board questions. I'll be asking you to closely read. So I want to give you an example of how to closely read. So here's an example. It's the opening sentence to Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. You probably are pretty familiar with it if you're a Harry Potter fan. I'm going to go ahead and read it. I want you to listen to it and see if anything is really striking to you. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Okay, great passage. So, first of all, let's try and tackle the level of denotation. The denotative level, again, is that kind of surface level of the text where we're just trying to grasp what it's saying. So, a good sort of denotative summary of the text would be that it's saying that Mr. and Mrs. Dursley are normal people, or that Mr. and Mrs. Dursley don't believe in magic. But we know that there's a lot more to it than that. And that's where we begin to get into the question of connotation, which is basically how is the text saying what it wants to say about the Dursleys without necessarily saying it aloud? That is, how is the text saying that the Dursleys are basically shallow social climbers without saying it aloud? So we can arrive at that information by using our close reading tools. And I've highlighted in red the close reading tools that I think might be most helpful to us. So let's see. Okay, so what you see here is on the right-hand side, the original passage that I read to you. Below that are our close reading tools with the ones that I think will work highlighted in red. Then on the left-hand side, I've repeated the denotative understanding, and I've just started noting down things that exist, I think, on a connotative level. I've listed them right here. First is that what we're given in this passage is not dialogue. This is a narrator's description. Um, but it's a moment where we're actually quite aware that the narrator is talking. So sometimes we have narrators that are seamless within a text. That is, that they just seem to be this sort of omniscient being that is telling us what other characters are thinking, but that does not play a role in the text. In this case, there seems to be a way in which the narrator is both omniscient, but also wants to very much make us aware that he or she is a narrator. Um, then I was interested in the tone. The tone strikes me as incredibly playful. So we actually read this and we know that the narrator is poking fun at the Dursleys. And I think that we know this because the diction enhances the tone. So here, the Dursleys are described as being, quote, proud of being normal. And the question is sort of why would somebody find it important to be proud of being normal? Um, the author also includes these little kind of sound bites. So it says here that the Dursleys are proud to say that they're perfectly normal. Thank you very much. And this seems like a moment where their narrator is actually sort of repeating something that the Dursleys might have said. This strikes me as an interjection. And then the author uses words like strange or mysterious or nonsense to describe what the Dursleys can't tolerate. And these words are telling us, they're just very specific words that are telling us that the Dursleys, in some sense, just reject anything that they can't immediately explain out of hand, anything that seems to hold a mystery, anything that seems sort of abnormal. So, based on all of these things that I've noted, I think I can arrive at some understanding of what the text is trying to tell us about the Dursleys and how it's telling us this without actually just telling us in, no, in totally specific terms that the Dursleys are, shallow, obnoxious, kind of social climbers. So here's what I've arrived at. It's in yellow. It's my sample literary analysis. And I'll read it to you. Quote, the opening description of the Dursleys relies on specific literary devices to make fun of the Dursleys. The overall tone of the passage is playful, and in fact achieved through the narrator's choice of personal details and phrases. First, the narrator identifies Mr. and Mrs. Dursley by their address, quote, number 4 Privet Drive, a detail that indicates their obsession with social status. Moreover, the author exaggerates their pride by including phrases that seem to have been directly lifted from the Dursleys themselves. They were perfectly normal, thank you very much, or they didn't hold with such nonsense. Emphasis is mine in those cases. Although these details set up the reader to understand the Dursleys as people who are altogether, these details set up the reader to understand the Dursleys as people who are very shallow. They are only interested in things that are easily comprehended. They're interested in surface rather than in substance. So, if you're reading this, you might think, well, of course I knew that the Dursleys were really interested in surface only. Of course I knew that the Dursleys were just social climbers. I knew that they were really shallow. What's going on when you're leaping to those conclusions is that you've already understood the connotation of the text. However, within literary analysis, we want to go back through and explain those steps of how we know that certain connotations exist, or we want to elucidate connotations that we think that other people should understand. And that's why what you might notice is in this literary analysis that I've written, I am constantly referring back to little pieces of the text, to little quoted elements of the text, because I want to highlight for my reader how the details of how this text has been put together matter. It's this kind of analysis that I look forward to seeing in your writing. That is, analyses that are really specific, that really walk the reader um, that really walk the reader through how you're arriving at conclusions that you're arriving at, and ones that use quotations. All right, please let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing you on the discussion board.